Going inside the issues of our community, this is Local 12 Newsmakers.
Good morning and welcome to Local 12 Newsmakers. Under pressure from low-growth economy, increasing expectations, and constant demands for public services, local governments find themselves pitted against each other in the scramble for adequate tax resources. That's especially clear in the current struggle between cities and counties of Kenton and Campbell County in northern Kentucky. The debate focuses on payroll taxes and was sparked by two taxpayer lawsuits over the last 4 years. The backdrop is complicated. Let me try to sketch it out. In 1978, Kenton County voters approved a measure to allow the fiscal court to levy a payroll tax of up to 1% on the first $25,000 of a worker's earnings. The court adopted only 0.4% of that tax at the time. Over the years, the rate rose to 0.85%. In 2000, the fiscal court reconfigured the tax, increasing the amount used for transportation, but kept the total at a constant level, below the 1% allowed in the 1978 law. In 1986, however, the Kentucky legislature had passed a law that requires counties on increases after 1986 to credit workers for payroll taxes they paid to cities. Last November, the state Supreme Court struck down a 2001 Kenton County payroll tax for a new county jail that did not credit city workers who paid payroll taxes to cities. Last month, another lawsuit challenged the legality of all county payroll taxes collected on increases since 1986. If the plaintiffs prevail, the counties might have to rebate almost a decade of receipts, estimated at $500 to about $700 per impacted individual and business, which could undermine the solvency of the two counties. The bottom line, if the plaintiffs win the latest lawsuit, at least in theory, funding for the regional bus system is endangered, as well as the operation of jails, road repair, lots of other services. To help us make sense of all this, if you're not confused already, I am joined this morning by Scott Kimmich, the Deputy Judge Executive of Kenton County, and Gary Toeggen, the President of Northern Kentucky Chamber of Commerce. Welcome to Newsmakers.
Good morning.
I don't know if I got all those details right, but in that history perspective, is that the basic line that, as you would say it, 1978 law adopted by the voters in the two counties, Kenton and Campbell, the 1986 law changing this, and then the challenges in the courts to increases after 1986. Is that a fair?
I guess there's just one thing that you didn't point out, Dan, and that is that the reason the legislature took this up in 1986 is because no other counties in the Commonwealth had passed on a public vote a payroll tax. And so the fiscal courts in all these other counties came to the legislature and said, it's too tough to pass this on a public vote. We need the authority to do this just as an action of the fiscal court. And so the legislature...
Without the voters.
Without the voters. So the legislature said, we'll do that, but as a proviso, we will then ask you to credit those cities, the taxpayers that are already paying a payroll tax in the city. That is fundamental to the reason that the counties in northern Kentucky never thought that they were part of the 1986 law and had proceeded. In fact, Campbell County increased its payroll tax 1 month after the 86 law went into effect, and no one gave it a thought, because the assumption by everyone was that because we'd had a public vote and the voters had spoken in northern Kentucky, they were not subject to the 86 Act of the legislature.
But just to be clear, the Supreme Court back in November ruled just the opposite.
That's
is that
correct.
correct?
That's correct.
So the law now is that those actions since 86 were in violation.
Yes, that is what the Supreme Court ruled.
Scott, I think you were about to say.
Well, the other point I'd like to make is that the 1978 levy that passed by the voters set 1%, and there was no cap. The $25,000 cap that was imposed was an arbitrary cap established by the fiscal courts as being a revenue source, providing sufficient revenue to provide for the services that they had asked the voters to approve. And it was basically in agreement with the chamber that they said, if you'll give us the levy up to 1% and no cap, we'll cap it at 4%, the 4/10 and $25,000 cap. So really what's happened is the fiscal courts have acted responsibly over a long period of time in not raising that rate to the voted levy, and it was not until they actually needed the money that they incrementally changed those dollars.
We're taping on Friday morning. This is going to air on Sunday morning. It's always a trick here. Last night, on Thursday night, February the 24th, yesterday during the day, the state lower house of the legislature, the House, passed a law that would try to deal with these court cases. What would that law do? It's been led by Representative Drought. What would that law do if it gets adopted by the Senate and the governor, and signed by the governor?
The law that Representative Drought introduced, that was amended by Representative Fisher's amendment, would simply acknowledge the right of the county to collect those revenues we're collecting today. In Kenton County, it'd be 6/10 on 25,000. In Campbell County, it's 9/10 with 38,000, I think, Gary. By passing 90-0 yesterday, I think what the General Assembly did was say that what we had argued in our court case was absolutely right. It was never the intent of the legislature to hamper county governments where it had been voted referendum. The Supreme Court disagreed with that. But I think yesterday on a 90-0 vote, Democrats and Republicans alike acknowledged the voters have spoken on this issue, and they're willing to give the counties the revenue they're getting today. We won't get the 1% unlimited caps. That was a compromise to get the bill passed, but we're comfortable with it.
You would be frozen, as I understand it, and talking to Representative Drought, things would be frozen where they are now. There'd be no flexibility in the future, which was implied back in the 78 law.
That is correct. And the reason that we agreed to the compromise was to have let the legislation fail as being seen by a tax increase by some of the legislators would have necessitated the two counties start paying refunds in the two counties up to $40 million.
Okay. If that law gets through the Senate, signed by the governor, my understanding is the constitutionality of that law will be immediately challenged. Is that your expectation?
Well, that, of course, is a possibility. It's not my expectation, but I think it is a possibility. I think the combination of a strong vote by the legislature and this outpouring of community support for continued mass transportation service would cause one to think twice before you filed another lawsuit.
Assuming that, I mean, we don't know ultimately what will happen in the legislature. We don't know ultimately what will happen in the courts. If the plaintiffs prevailed, though, what would this mean? You've mentioned some paybacks, some rebates. You just mentioned tank. What's the bottom line? How does this affect people?
If this legislation were to fail, or if the plaintiffs are successful in their case, in Kenton County, the situation is that today tank is getting $6.1 million. They would immediately be reduced to just over $3 million. That's not taking into consideration the amount of refunds that would have to be paid. But they're looking at a 50% reduction, about 48% reduction in funds in Kenton County. We're providing 48% of the total funding for the mass transit on the public sector side. In Campbell County, Judge Pendry has made it clear if we're not successful and the plaintiffs prevail, in Campbell County, tank would get zero. So in essence, the plaintiffs in this case, if successful, would end mass transit as we know it today in Northern Kentucky.
Now the plaintiffs, though, or the attorney for the plaintiffs, in a conversation I've had, argue that they don't want tank to suffer, and they've gone back and amended their suit to make sure that tank is sort of grandfathered in here and is not going to suffer. What's your understanding of that?
Well, in Kenton County today, tank we're spending 0.48 of the 0.6 that we're collecting goes directly to tank. Under their lawsuit, that would be rolled back immediately to 4%, and there would be, or 0.4%, and there would be refunds paid. So it means at minimum a 20% reduction in service, and then we have to deal with the refund issue. The refund issue is something we're still litigating, so I really can't discuss that. That's the reason when people say to me, well, your impact doesn't seem as bad as Campbell's, I'm not going to talk about refunds. That's still in litigation, how long back we have to go and things like that. But the immediate impact would be 0.48 that's going to tank today would be at 0.4 if they're successful.
One thing here about tank, how important is, and Gary, you're the president of the chamber, how important is tank to the economy of Northern Kentucky that we all know from a regional perspective is one of the healthier sectors of our economy? How important is tank?
Well, it's very important, and that's why there's been such an outpouring of support from the business community for this initiative to pass legislation. Our major employers all support this initiative. 12,000 people a day ride tank. and that's the employees that work at our businesses, and so many other people who just don't have access to private vehicular transportation.
And one of the places that would be particularly hard hit is one of your real growth businesses, which is the airport. Is that right?
Right. In fact, there are 500 people a day who work at the airport who ride tank.
And just in case people maybe don't think about this, this isn't just a Northern Kentucky issue, because anybody who rides the buses know that tank comes across downtown 4th Street in downtown Cincinnati in the #1 airport bus. There are people from this side of the river going out there to work as well. So this impacts people all over the region.
That's right.
You're saying that you can't talk about the rebate question at this stage? If, though, you're not a public official, if these two counties had to rebate, what would it mean practically?
Well, as a practical matter, if you're talking about approximately a $20 million rebate for each of the counties, and I think Campbell County's general fund budget's $12 or $13 million. I don't know where they get the money. I guess you have to tax your citizens on one side to pay the refunds on the other.
So you'd have to find a new source of revenue.
Right.
Could it be possible that, you know, if this whole thing, if you don't prevail in the legislature or you don't prevail in the courts, could you go back to the voters and start over again? Could the voters come back, you offer them a chance to vote a levy, and they could recreate this, post all of this mess, and put tank back and, you know, solve this that way?
Perhaps. I don't think I know at this point in time.
I think that, Dan, that's a possibility. The conflict you run into is that the state law is pretty clear that referendums can only be heard in November elections. We don't have elections in 2005 in Kentucky, so it'll be 2006 before the voters could vote. By that time, the mass transit system would be crippled. You know, this lawsuit and the implications of it really are the unintended consequences of well-intentioned people. The lawsuit was filed to keep the county from raising the tax and creating a burden on businesses. I don't think any of the consequences of the refunds and rollbacks were ever intended. I think the fact that the city of Covington, who was a plaintiff in the first lawsuit, is not a plaintiff in this suit, and in fact endorsed unanimously by signature, all 5 members of that commission, including the mayor, asked the legislature to pass this bill and fix this problem.
Well, thank you very much. This is a complicated issue. I hope we've clarified it for people, and we're obviously going to follow this in the next few weeks as the legislature winds up its session. Stay tuned. After the break, the international implications of the American debate on reproductive rights. Okay, stay right there. Welcome back. Every American knows that the issue of reproductive rights is politically divisive in domestic politics. Because of the power and influence of the United States throughout the world, that debate impacts people everywhere. Recently, the Urban Morgan Institute on International Human Rights at the University of Cincinnati College of Law invited an expert on the implications of international human rights on the issues of reproduction and sexual health to address students from the colleges of law and medicine. Rebecca Cook is the co-director of the International Program on Reproductive and Sexual Health Law at the University of Toronto, a professor on the faculties of both law and medicine, and a member of the Joint Center for Bioethics. Rebecca, welcome to Cincinnati, and I know you've been here a number of times. Welcome to Newsmakers. What is the legal framework from an international law point of view on issues dealing with sexual health, reproductive issues? Is there any sort of positive statements out there?
Very much so. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is the key international treaty that empowers women, requires that states treat them equally in all aspects of their lives, including health.
And when was that signed?
That came into effect in 1979. And the United States has signed the treaty but has not yet ratified it. It is one of 2 countries that have yet to ratify the treaty, the United States and Somalia.
Are the only 2? So we have signed it, but not ratified by the Senate, which means that is the United States obligated to, are we holding back and saying we don't have to observed that?
We're holding back in that we haven't fully ratified it. We're sort of thinking about joining the club, but we haven't yet joined the club.
We've been thinking since 1979.
We've been thinking since 1979.
Because of the we and whatever, I want to make clear, you're an American citizen, but you teach at the University of Toronto. Is that correct?
That's indeed.
Okay. So the we's and who's and whatever could be a little bit confusing. What is at stake for real women around the world around these, when you say reproductive rights, sexual health, what's that boil down to for individual people in different countries?
It boils down to the most basic level, access to treatment and access to care. For example, with safe motherhood, women in the developing world just do not have access to trained birth attendants. And as a result, about 500,000 women die a year due to pregnancy-related causes.
So what are governments through these treaties, is it their obligation to improve those sorts of things? Do international organizations, the Red Cross, for example, or other non-governmental organizations, NGOs, do they have responsibilities? What is the responsibility here to do something about that kind of thing?
States are obligated to ensure that women have access to care, particularly for conditions which only affect women, for example, pregnancy and childbirth. And where they do not have access to care, states are obligated to ensure that they do have access. And this is this tragic problem of the lack of access to care to ensure that women can go through pregnancy and childbirth safely is something that is a travesty of justice for women.
Is there any teeth to the conventions, to the treaties that have been signed and ratified by most countries, and there's others as well? Is there any teeth to the laws in this area, or are these basically expressions of goodwill without any ability to enforce anything?
There is some ability to enforce, and with international law, there's no international police force, but you can use these treaties to name and shame. And they are used to name and shame, and they are used as a benchmark by which we monitor our progress. The World Health Organization has done a great deal of work in terms of trying to set indicators by which we measure whether women in fact are getting access to care to ensure that they can survive pregnancy and childbirth. But in 2005, we have a great deal to do. This year is the 10th anniversary of the Beijing Women's Conference, and yet again it will be used to highlight these problems that women face in little villages, in small hamlets around the world, of not being able to access to care.
In the American domestic situation, the big debate is focused around abortion. How does that specific issue, and I'd say maybe a related issue in a larger sense of access to contraception, how do those two issues, how are they treated in this international legal structure?
It's unfortunate that so much of the debate in the U.S. is around abortion. We could be doing so much more to prevent the need for abortion, to prevent unwanted pregnancy. For example, through emergency contraception, we could be preventing the need for abortion. And
what do you mean by emergency contraception?
Emergency contraception is oral contraceptives that are used within 72 hours of unprotected intercourse. And if it is taken within, sooner the better, but within 72 hours, it has a very high chance of preventing an unwanted pregnancy or pregnancy.
This is the so-called morning after pill.
The so-called morning after pill.
Yeah, it goes under different names.
Yeah,
but And so you're saying access to that. Is the lack of access around the world, I know there's the United States, the developed countries, the United States, there's Europe, there's different opinions in different countries about this. But then in the third world, is it a problem of just people don't have access because they don't have funding, because there isn't the availability, or does it go beyond that? Are there other blocks?
It goes way beyond that. In fact, one could use the emergency contraception case study, and it's not only here in the United States, it's in Canada, it's in Mexico. It's a huge battleground, the access to emergency contraception. And in some ways, I refer to it as the modern-day Inquisition. It's here in the United States. The administration has chosen to ignore the advice of its scientific advisory board to the Food and Drug Administration that it is safe and effective to have this drug over the counter as a non-prescription access. The Center for Reproductive Rights has filed a case against the FDA for ignoring the advice of its own scientific advisory board. I don't think it's ever ignored the advice of its scientific advisory board in the past. And their case has been filed last week against the FDA for delaying yet again this decision on moving emergency contraception from a prescription to a non-prescription drug. This is in stark contrast to what the world has done vis-a-vis Viagra. We're privileging men's sexuality and we're ignoring women's needs for drugs that are specific to their health problems.
What do you say to people who say that from a moral perspective, they are opposed to abortion, they're opposed to the morning after pill, because it's not, from that perspective, it's not just emergency contraception, it is a form of abortion. What do you say to people about that who say that, you know, the United States has to pursue, debate that inside, decide what its policies are, its values are, and then act on this?
For those who are against abortion, I have tremendous respect. I myself am against abortion, and I've done work for most of my professional life to enable and empower women to prevent unwanted pregnancy and thus the need for abortion. What I say to those that are opposed, I salute you, I promote your points of view. I too am against abortion. But where I draw the line is that they do not and should not in a democracy have the ability to impose their values on other people through public policies. That's where I draw the line. And we see this in the battleground in terms of, say, for example, pharmacists refusing to provide emergency contraception, and they too have to accommodate women's rights of conscientious objection.
Staying in the international realm here for the moment, how has the United States government, current administration, because we're now into a second term for the Bush administration, what sort of policies vis-a-vis the United Nations, vis-a-vis the NGOs, you know, on this issue, what has been the policy of the United States in this administration?
I think in terms of its foreign aid policies, it is used what is called a gag rule. It will not give to a foreign NGO that uses its own private funds to promote women's empowerment, to promote advocacy and debate around issues like abortion, like trafficking of women, like HIV/AIDS, and the abstinence-only policy. I think it's very unfortunate because the U.S. administration is really, in some ways, preventing women to be full citizens in other countries. So President Bush's recent speech, his inaugural speech, rings very hollow to my friends in the developing world. Freedom and democracy, yes, for some, but not freedom and democracy for women. And I find that very unfortunate.
We're running out of time, but I want to explore one more thing. How does all of this play in places that are, for example, the Muslim world, which also has very harsh policies towards women on many, many levels? How do these issues get played out in those countries?
Well, in some parts of the world, Muslim world, they do have harsh policies, but what I find very gratifying about certain parts of the Muslim world and with certain Arabs and Muslims that I work with is their concept of tolerance and respect for tolerance and respect for human dignity. And certainly building upon those very fundamental principles of Islam, respect for tolerance, respect for human dignity, there is a great deal of work that's being done to achieve rights and dignity for women in that part of the world. Emergency contraception, The modern-day Inquisition in that part of the world is also a problem. But at least within Islam, at least within the Arab world, there's some remarkable people who are doing work to promote women's rights in that part of the world.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being here. Good luck with your talk to the students, and look forward to return to Cincinnati.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for making Local 12 Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Join us again next week to meet the women and the men shaping our community and the world for the future. Have a good week.